She hung there like some corner creature, her wrists and ankles stretched wide by coarse ropes, her dress shredded, her face lined with dust, sweat, and humiliation. And the harsh noon sun of Dodge City scorched her skin until it seemed ready to peel. Rosa Miller was only 22, and she no longer possessed the strength to cry out. Only a brittle whisper escaped her broken lips each time the rope dug tighter into her shoulders. She had been abandoned in the middle of the Kansas plains, abandoned to endure, abandoned to break. A breeze rolled through the tall summer grass. It carried no kindness. The wooden A-frame that held her groaned with every gust as though sneering at her weight. Her toes hovered inches above the dirt. Every breath felt like it might be her last. She hadn't been up there all day, but several hours beneath that sun felt close enough to eternity. Rose had known there would be consequences for stealing from Sheriff Eli Thompson. She simply never thought the consequences would look like this. She believed she'd be thrown in a cell, not strung up like a spectacle for anyone who dared challenge the law of Dodge City. Her breath stuttered shallow. Then came the sound of hooves, slow and rhythmic, approaching beyond the rise with the easy pace of a man unaware he was riding straight into another soul's torment. Jim Blake emerged from the wavering heat, a rancher in his late 40s. Weathered features, steady eyes, someone familiar with storms on land and storms inside the human spirit. He reined his horse to a halt, his gaze fixed on the figure suspended in the sunlight. Shock cut through his expression, then fury, then something softer, something like sorrow. He moved toward her. Rose lifted her head with the last thread of strength in her body. She assumed he'd come to finish whatever Sheriff Thompson had begun. Her voice shook like something already fading. Don't do this, she breathed. Jim stopped short, not because of the plea, but because of the way she uttered it. As if she had already accepted that mercy had no place for someone like her, he moved toward the ropes. She recoiled. He didn't pause. He examined every knot, every bruise, every mark carved across her body. And in that instant, Jim Blake understood one thing without a trace of doubt. Whatever this girl had done, nothing on earth warranted this. His fingers clamped around the handle of his knife. The plains waited in stillness. The sun pressed hotter, and Rose Miller hung suspended between living and dying, while a rancher she had never known prepared to make a decision that would alter both of their fates forever. If Jim Blake freed her, would the law hunt him next and wipe them out before the truth ever reached the light? The knife gleamed once beneath the sun. Then Jim Blake sliced the rope. Rose fell like a dropped bundle of grain. He caught her midway, her weight crashing into his chest. She dragged in a breath, air cutting into her lungs like flame. Her legs refused to hold anything at all. Had he arrived 5 minutes later, she might have already slipped away. Jim eased an arm behind her shoulders, another beneath her knees. She was too light, far too light for someone her age. He lifted her the way he would a wounded calf and carried her from that cursed A-frame. He placed in the shade of a stunted tree for a time, offered her water in slow, careful sips, and waited until her gaze steadied before he even considered setting her on a horse. Up close, she didn't resemble a criminal, only a frightened girl with a firm jaw and eyes that kept forcing themselves open. Her lips wavered. "I stole from him," she breathed. "From Sheriff Thompson. I went into his office, cracked his safe, took his money." Jim held silent for a moment. The admission settled in his stomach like lead. So she truly had stolen. The sheriff hadn't lied about that. He placed her gently onto the saddle, then mounted behind her, so she wouldn't slip. Her head leaned against his shoulder. The horse moved forward. He could feel every tremor rippling through her. "You know he had every right to lock you in a cell," Jim murmured. "A cell?" she rasped. "Not a rope in the middle of the prairie." That silenced him for a long stretch. They traced the Arkansas River, the water shining at their side. Jim watched the trail ahead, but his thoughts were a tempest. He honored the law. This land went feral without it. Yet what he had witnessed didn't resemble law at all. It felt like brutality wearing justice's clothing. By the time they reached the low ridges where his ranch rested, the sun was sinking. The modest house appeared ahead. One porch, one chimney. Smoke drifting lazily into the dimming sky. Jim brought Rose inside and set her on his own bed. He filled a basin with water, ripped an old shirt into strips, and began tending the rope burns along her wrists. She flinched but never pulled away. "Tomorrow I'll take you in," he said at last. "You stole. You answer for that." But in a courtroom, not strung up like some prize. Rose stared upward at the ceiling. Something heavier pressed behind her gaze. Something darker than mere stealing. But she forced it down. Why tell this man she had witnessed Sheriff Thompson commit something far worse than anything she'd ever done? Tonight, she would simply be a thief who survived. And Jim would be a rancher who refused to ride past cruelty. Outside, the Kansas horizon burned red and gold. And somewhere distant, a lone rider had begun asking questions about the girl who'd vanished from his rope. When that rider reached this ranch, whose side would Jim Blake choose? Morning on the Blake ranch rose softly. Too softly for what approached. Jim was awake before dawn as usual. He fed the horses, checked the trough, and tried his best not to glance at the bedroom door, where Rose slept in his bed while he made do with the old cot beside the stove. He told himself it was straightforward. He would bring her back into town. He would stand with her before the judge. The law would do what the law was supposed to do. No more ropes on open prairie. That tidy plan survived right up until he heard horses racing hard up the lane. Not a wagon, not a friendly neighbor. 3 riders, one relentless pounding rhythm. Jim stepped onto the porch, brushing his hands against his trousers. Sheriff Eli Thompson rode in through the gate with 2 deputies close behind. Dust rose in thick waves around the horses, and those sharp, calculating eyes swept over the house, the barn, the tracks. Then they fixed on Jim. "Morning, Blake." The sheriff smiled, though nothing warm touched his eyes. "Seems someone went and cut down my thief." Jim felt the lie forming, choking itself off halfway, so he gave the plain truth. "I found a girl hanging where the buzzard circled. I brought her here so she didn't die like a stray." "You interfere with evidence," Thompson snapped. "She belongs in my jail." The smile vanished entirely. Jim shook his head. "She belongs in a courtroom. What you did wasn't justice." For a moment, they simply stared. An old rancher on the porch, a man with a badge in the yard. One of those quiet crossroads where men reveal what they truly were. Inside, Rose stood barefoot just behind the door, muscles tight as wire. She heard every word. She knew that voice. She remembered the dust choking her throat while his rope tightened. If he dragged her back, there'd be no trial, no chance, just another sun-blasted ride, and an unmarked grave somewhere no one would ever find. Her pulse hammered. Her mouth dried out. She steadied herself against the doorframe, then slipped silently into the kitchen while the men argued. When Jim finally stepped back inside, his jaw was clenched hard enough to crack. "He wants you back," Jim said. "He claims that rope was legal." Word had already swept through Dodge City. Jim Blake had cut down the thief. Some called him a fool, but most said the sheriff had been humiliated in front of everyone. Rose looked at him. Really looked. This man had already risked himself once by saving her. If she stayed silent, he'd walk right into the sheriff's snare. If she told the truth, both might lose their lives before another sunrise. Her voice scraped out, thin and rough. "Jim, I did steal, but I stole the wrong thing. I took money that wasn't his to keep. And I saw what he did to the man it belonged to." Jim stared hard at her. "What did you see, Rose?" She drew in a shuddering breath. Once she answered, there'd be no turning back for either of them. Before we follow Jim and Rose into that shadow path, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story leads. And while you're here, take a sip of whatever you're drinking and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're listening from. Rose didn't lift her gaze to meet Jim's. She stared at the worn wooden floor as though the truth were carved into the planks. "I was cleaning the office," she whispered at last. Sheriff figured I had slipped home, her fingers knotting in her skirt. "I heard a man come in," she murmured. "Not Army. Just some trail-beat stranger in a dust-coated jacket with a Wells Fargo badge pinned to his chest. He carried a leather satchel swung across his shoulder. They fought about cash, about money meant for the rail line that never made it there." Jim stayed silent. He could hear his pulse thudding. Then came the gunshot. Rose breathed. Just one. The courier dropped flat. Sheriff stood there with smoke drifting from his pistol like it was no crime at all. She gulped. He packed the corpse in a tarp, hauled it to a wagon, and rattled off past the last houses toward a cut bank on the Arkansas River where folks don't wander. That leather satchel ended up locked in his vault. Same one I lifted. I thought I was stealing from a greedy brute. Turns out I robbed a grave instead. Stillness pooled across the room. Jim had crossed paths with rough men before. Rustlers, fighters, drifters. But Sheriff murdering a courier for cash, then stringing up a girl to hide it. That cut different. If we stay here, Rose said, he'll ride back with a rope and a tail. And only one of those will be real. Jim dragged a hand over his jaw, eyes sliding toward the pain where the sheriff had ridden off. Fort Dodge, he muttered. The soldiers trade with the railmen. They'll listen when a Wells Fargo satchel goes missing and Thompson can't bend their ear. By sundown, they were mounted. Jim lashed a small bedroll behind his horse, stowed the stolen peril deep beneath his coat, and boosted Rose up before him. She still flinched with each movement, but her voice didn't tremble. If we ride out, there's no going back, she said. There wasn't any going back the second I cut you loose. He replied. They traced the Arkansas River again. Not slow this time, but driving hard, dust flying. Behind them, up on the rise near the Blake place, Sheriff Thompson watched two tiny shadows fleeing west, dust twisting after them. His deputies eased in their saddles, waiting for his order. He didn't need glass to see that if they reached the fort, his rope games were spent. His whole future was wrecked. He kicked his horse, so fierce it screeched, and signaled one deputy to follow, while the other swung wide to blur their trail. 3 guns chasing one rancher, and one girl who'd learned too much. Dust bled out as Jim and Rose spotted the first lantern glow of Fort Dodge ahead. Hoofs pounded nearer behind. If the guards at that gate trust the sheriff before they trust a thief and an old cowhand, what do you reckon comes next on that black road? At the post's edge, a sentry stepped out, rifle raised. He barked for them to halt. Jim yanked the reins so sharp the horse skidded. Rose nearly toppled. The sentry didn't care who they were. He cared that night was closing in and 3 riders were raising dust at his gate. Sheriff Thompson barreled in a breath later with 2 deputies at his heels. Their horses streaked with sweat, his badge flashing in the last scraps of sun. Everyone started talking over everyone. The sheriff brandishing his badge. Jim showing his empty hands. Rose barely clinging to the saddle horn. The sentry did what a trained soldier does. He sealed the gate. He split them apart, and he called for an officer. That girl is a thief, the sheriff barked, and the old man is shielding her. I am here to drag her back to Dodge City Law. Maybe that might have flown any other night, but Jim Blake hadn't ridden this far to stand mute. He slipped off his mount, legs trembling chest tight, and dragged a heavy leather pay bag from beneath his coat. He dropped it at the soldier's boots. That's Wells Fargo money, Jim said. Their courier never reached the rails. She knows why. Every gaze shifted to Rose. She could have stayed quiet, could have melted into the dark, and let her chance choke out right there. Instead, she climbed down from the saddle and stood beside Jim. Her voice trembled, but it held. She told him about the gunshot in the office, the Wells Fargo man hitting the floor, the corpse hauled out of town in a tarp to a forgotten cut bank by the river. The officer didn't leap to answers. Papers were checked, names recorded, a telegram sent down the line asking if a courier had vanished on that trail. For days after, Jim and Rose stayed inside the fort, not locked up, but not free to roam either. They repeated the same tale more than once. It never shifted. When word returned that a Wells Fargo rider and his peril had disappeared weeks earlier, the captain ordered 10 men toward Dodge City with Jim and Rose traveling under guard. Men like that don't forget the dead. Eyes sharpened, rifles raised. And for the first time in a long while, the sheriff found himself staring into barrels that weren't pointed for him, but at him. They rode back into Dodge City with a small detachment of soldiers and a federal officer from the fort. They dug where Rose told them to dig along that lonely cut bank by the Arkansas River. They uncovered bones, Scraps of cloth, a bent metal tag stamped with the express company mark that matched the missing courier. Eli Thompson wasn't thrown on a gallows the next dawn. He was shackled and taken east under watch. A few months later, he stood inside a courthouse in Topeka before a judge who didn't owe him a single kindness. As for Jim and Rose, they headed home, no longer outlaw and captor, but two people who had ridden to the same fire and somehow stayed standing. Rose worked the Blake Ranch to repay what she'd taken and a bit extra. She learned to braid ropes for colts instead of for punishment. On quiet evenings, she and Jim sat on the porch, watching the Kansas sky fade from gold to violet, speaking little, needing less. Maybe that's the true center of this tale. Sometimes justice only shows up because one stubborn soul won't turn away from another's hurt. Sometimes the one branded thief is the only person brave enough to speak what's real. If you had ridden past that lonely frame that day, would you have cut Rose down knowing trouble would come hunting you after? Have you ever witnessed something wrong and had to choose between silence or standing tall? If this story stirred anything in you, tap like so others can find it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ride out into the Old West with us. And before you go, pour yourself another cup of coffee or tea and tell me in the comments what time it is right now and where you're listening from.